Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Richard Copeland, sitting in for Sharon Stone. Coming up, we'll look into a federal program funding the replacement of lead piping and why Florida has claimed the lion's share of national funding. Also, we'll talk with the author of a book about banned books that was banned by the Indian River School District. But first, as Central Floridians watch the final remnants of Hurricane Debby cycle out of the region, a substantial portion of the area's unhoused population are simply trying to survive while anticipating the next storm to pass through. This will be an especially vexing hurricane season for the providers of homeless services in Central Florida. The 1-2 punch of a rapidly growing population experiencing homelessness, coupled with accelerated storm predictions, have organizations like Christian Services Center scrambling to secure both funding and volunteers to help provide shelter, services, and material support for the region's unsheltered during extreme weather events. A point-in-time count of Orange County's homeless population in June showed the area's unsheltered more than doubled in the last 12 months, from under 600 to just over 1,200. Eric Gray is the executive director of the Christian Service Center. He joined Engage yesterday to talk about his nonprofit's response to Debby, and the conversation began with Gray explaining how Christian Service Center kicks into gear the moment a tropical depression is identified.
We start reminding our staff about the protocols and procedures that we have because it can be many months in between those different events, and we have new staff. Then we communicate with the Homeless Services Network and what we call the Continuum of Care, which is 50 agencies in the 3-county area. They have a staff member who's assigned to send out regular weather updates and to coordinate any type of services that are needed. And they coordinate with local emergency management from Orange, Seminole, Osceola County, and the city of Orlando. And then we discuss whether or not certain shelter space needs to be opened up, or any other type of interior spaces, or if any services need to be rendered, bus services, any additional food, clothing, those types of emergency services. And I don't have to say there's no silver lining to a major storm, but it's one thing. We usually have multiple days notice when something's coming. So we have a pretty good preparation process for unsheltered adults here in the community.
And this is a community that can be dangerous for the vulnerable, for the unsheltered, when you take the heat into account. I know this sounds like an obvious question, but talk about the dangers of being unsheltered when these storms roll through.
Well, I think the dangers, some of them are going to be pretty obvious to most people. Just the idea of there being, down trees and power lines, the idea that, being outside and potentially in weather that could be dangerous, like lightning strikes and tornadoes, that'd be the same as for anyone. The difference here is that people who are experiencing homelessness don't typically have some place to find shelter. In an event like the one we had this weekend, I guess it's still technically happening. We didn't get to the tropical storm or hurricane warning status, so we didn't open up interior spaces for overnights, because our protocol is when you have tropical storm force winds and then hurricane level winds in the area, then that's when you go to those types of openings. But these folks still had to endure a lot of rain. So during our normal hours, we yesterday and today, we opened up some of the interior spaces during the day. And right across the hall from me, we have about 60 or so people who are just, inside big open room that we have where they can just dry out right now. They're just drying off. And it's just hard to find a place to get dry at all. So, because then you can lead to things that people wouldn't expect. And some of the things that people wouldn't expect would include the idea of, pneumonia from having been outside, in the rain and having other respiratory problems. Also, the issue of people living in their cars. There can be some danger to people experiencing heat exhaustion because they're inside a vehicle for too long a period of time. And about half of people experiencing homelessness here in Florida are doing so living in a car. And so that can be particularly dangerous, particularly for children and older adults. And the fastest growing populations of people experiencing homelessness are adults over age 75 and children under 12. So there's some things that just aren't as commonly understood about the population of people experiencing homelessness, and we have to, keep in mind the realities of those folks and what they're struggling with.
And I know this seems somewhat flippant, but for many people, there isn't functionality without their pets.
No, I don't. It's not flippant at all. I mean, I think that one of the major barriers to people being able to access shelter, their willingness to leave a pet behind. Right now, we don't have any shelters in the community that are accepting of animals. That may change in the future, but right now that's just the reality we live in. And so I've personally worked with multiple adults who, rather than go into a shelter when there was space, have stayed out on the streets in order to not leave a pet behind. And remember a particular example of a woman named Brenda who had a Jack Russell Terrier, and she came to us the day before she was going to be experiencing homelessness. She'd been evicted from her apartment, had nowhere to go, no family. She's in her mid to late 60s, had never had anything go like this before, and we found her a bed, but she just could not leave her dog behind. And so she ended up sleeping outside in this area in Paramore for a number of weeks before we could find her some appropriate accommodations. And the difference in how she appeared and how she behaved from the first day till about a month later was just totally different people. And the experience of living on the streets is a horror show. Most of us can't really ever imagine. And particularly for women, if you're on the streets for more than a week or so, the statistical likelihood of you being beaten, robbed, raped, or arrested is extremely high. And so it's not something that people do by choice. They do it because they have no other choice.
This year's hurricane prediction is, I don't want to use hyperbole, but very large, off the charts, predicting more between 25 and 30 tropical depressions. When you see these predictions come out, how do you prepare, and both from a service standpoint, but also how do you, Eric Gray, mentally prepare for something like that?
Well, we have to prepare for the increase in the number of people that we know are going to be coming to our campuses and using our services. We haven't seen a decrease in the number of people coming over the last 5 years. It's gone up every year, and this last year was the biggest increase. So we have to get to the place where we prepare and budget for ourselves. Instead of serving 300 meals at lunchtime, we're serving 400. Instead of serving 150 meals at dinner time, we're serving 200. And those numbers just keep going up a little bit each month. So we just, for us, it's like any business. We are just trying to plan for the future as best we can and make sure that, we are providing the service that, we're set out to do and doing the best job that we can with it. Our staff are really amazing. We have some just absolutely amazing people, all of whom should be up for, some type of Nobel Peace Prize, in my opinion. But they really do a great job of looking out for our guests, whether they be 6-year-old children or 75-year-old, woman, or anybody in between. It's just it's an everyday occurrence. We really work very hard to make sure that they're taking care of themselves. We put them through lots of trainings. We have a lot of flexibility. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody really appreciates the size and scope of the domestic refugee crisis that we're currently in the United States. We'll accept 60,000 foreign refugees in the U.S. this year, which is an amazing program and probably the best in the world. But tonight, there will be about 500,000 people who sleep on the streets or in a car or in a shelter in the United States of America tonight. And that's just an overwhelming number that I don't think most people really have an appreciation for how large the size and scope of the problem really is.
When these do get picked up on the radar, there's the narrative about, for most of us, preparing, get water, food supplies, if you've got a generator, get gas, those kinds of things. These are not the protocols for somebody who's experiencing homelessness, who's unsheltered. So in what way can somebody who's living under those circumstances best prepare themselves when these tropical depressions start cultivating into storms?
Well, I think they have to identify where they're going to ride the storm out and where they can seek some type of shelter and not get rained on. And that's getting harder and harder because, all property in our country is either privately owned or publicly owned. And there are very few private landowners or business owners that want unsheltered adults on their property for any period of time. And starting October 1, it will be illegal for cities and counties to allow people to be on public property. So it's effectively going to become illegal to be homeless in the state of Florida starting October 1st. And so it's hard to prepare because there's just not very many places to go. But we do try and disseminate information as best we can. The city and the county, in extreme weather events, will open up some shelters at places like local high school gymnasiums. They do run the Lynx bus system for free for people, usually about 24 hours in advance of a storm. And so there are protocols out there. I think what we're trying to evolve to understand is that these aren't always major Category 4 hurricanes. Sometimes we have these tropical storms come through, sometimes major heat waves come through, sometimes, cold snaps, and we don't have the same level of reaction to some of these sort of mid-major types of weather events, but they're happening more often. I don't know why they're happening. I just know they're happening. And so we are having to basically use more resources, use more manpower, and try to communicate more and more with the people who are coming to us. And these are not usually people who have been out on the streets their whole lives. Most people experiencing homelessness do so for just a couple of weeks, and they find a solution on their own. But during those couple of weeks, there can be some devastating consequences because they have no idea what to do. They're done on a regular basis, much less during an extreme weather event.
That was Eric Gray, the executive director of Christian Service Center, speaking with Engage yesterday. Coming up, we'll talk about a federal program for replacing the nation's lead pipes and why Florida is positioned to take far more than its fair share of funding. Later, we'll talk with an author whose book about banned books was banned, and we'll hear from the person who requested its removal from an Indian River middle school. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Richard Copeland, sitting in for Sharon Stone. Ahead on the program, Florida has become the epicenter of the nation's book banning trend. We'll speak with an author of a banned book about banned books and why he wrote a book for young adults called Ban This Book.
I wanted to write a book back then that highlighted what I felt like was something that was happening under the radar. Cut to today, not even 10 years later, and book banning has become an epidemic.
We'll speak with Alan Gratz, author of Ban This Book, and we'll hear from the Moms for Liberty representative who recommended its removal. But first, one of the pinnacle achievements of the Biden administration is the Investing in America agenda, promoting infrastructure development as well as a committed investment in STEM industries. One of the lesser-known provisions of the agenda includes an effort to replace the lead pipes used to build out much of America's plumbing needs. The use of lead pipes dates back to Roman times. It wasn't until the 1950s, though, that the danger of using lead to deliver water became apparent. But lead pipes are still used extensively. A 2004 report uncovered the catastrophic impacts of lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, despite the knowledge of the area's water district. This was one of the catalysts encouraging the White House to commit funds to replacing lead pipes. The EPA sent a survey out to all 50 states to report lead pipe usage to gauge what needed to be replaced. The state of Florida reported it had so much lead piping that would require 1/15 of all of the national funding. In actuality, Florida doesn't have much in the way of lead plumbing. But the money has been appropriated, and Florida squiring these funds means other states genuinely in need of pipe replacement cannot access that money for the time being. Nick Tabor is a freelance investigative reporter. He researched and filed a deep dive into this process for the New Republic. I spoke with Tabor about this program and began our conversation by asking how Florida was able to wrangle the lion's share of funding from the federal government.
Several years ago, the EPA sent out surveys to all the states trying to gauge how many lead pipes they had underground, channeling water into people's faucets. And it looks as if a lot of the utilities in Florida said, look, we don't know how many lead pipes we have. We've never done inventories. But somehow the EPA ended up with this data that says Florida has tons of lead pipes, like more than any other state. And it's a little bit of a mystery where the error was made. There's some disagreement about that. But the upshot is that the data says Florida's got all these lead pipes. And so as a result, it's just because of the EPA's formula, it's entitled to all of this money.
And I'll get to where that money's going in just a moment. But from what I gather, there were multiple Florida water districts that said they never even submitted lead pipe data that actually appeared in some of the final appropriation reports.
Yeah, that's true. Like Pinellas County, for instance, I've seen this spreadsheet that they sent to the state government. It just says unknown. It's like for the whole count, it just says like, we haven't done an inventory, we don't know. I have not contacted every utility myself, but some advocates at the Environmental Defense Fund did speak with a number of Florida utilities, and they kept getting the same response. These utilities were saying, we don't know where these numbers came from. But it's important to note that they were sending their figures to the state government, and then the state government was communicating with the EPA.
Back in May, the EPA Inspector General, who was doing the deeper dive on these numbers, reported that 2 states had submitted funding requests with inaccurate data. Those states were unnamed. Do we now know that one of those was, in fact, Florida?
It's quite clear that one is Florida. They don't say it outright, but I mean, all the evidence points to Florida. I don't think anybody's disputing that Florida is one of the states they mean.
Is there any speculation as to which the other state is?
Texas. We're pretty sure it's Texas.
Gotcha. So Florida doesn't have as much lead piping as it had reported. Was there any verification or on these reports, or were they all taken at face value?
Well, they were essentially taken at face value. That's what the Inspector General says. I will say that last year, the EPA said, okay, we think some of these numbers are wrong. We're going to give all the states a chance to revise their numbers if they want. And Florida's figure barely changed. So apparently they were satisfied with it where it was.
Okay, so going back to the money itself, the money will only cover as much as needs to be covered, and the excess will roll over to other states as needed. So I understand that this requires some speculation, but why would the state overreport? Why would the state do this?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say, so the state's response, and I should say the state never spoke to me. They told me they were going to get me a response, and then they stopped answering my calls. So they didn't speak to me, but they did say to WFSU, the station in South Florida, they said, look, this is the EPA's fault. The EPA gave us this methodology, told us how to generate estimates, how to crunch the numbers, and we just used their methodology, and this is what we came up with. And the state government even said, we think these estimates are wrong, but we're just using the EPA's guidelines. But if they were just using the guidelines that every state is supposed to use, it doesn't make a lot of sense that Florida would be the only state with wildly inflated numbers. So there's some speculation that maybe there was just a mistake made there, that somehow the state government sort of misunderstood or misapplied the EPA's guidelines. I will say that I don't think that it was like a nefarious act. I don't think that this was an attempt to defraud the federal government and take more money than the state was supposed to get.
And there's no way for the state to seize that excess money and reallocate it in any way?
Not really. One of the concerns is that the state will just spend a lot of money, and local utilities will spend a lot of money doing inventories. They could say, well, we're just going to dig up every single pipe and see whether it's made of lead or copper. And, you can do that. There's a much more efficient way to do it. You could, for a couple $100,000, you can just use data analytics and make a pretty good educated guess. Or you can spend millions of dollars digging up every pipe. So there is a concern that the state is going to waste some of this money, but I don't see it wasting $1 billion. It would be pretty hard to spend that much on inventories.
And looking at this outside of Florida, one of the bigger problems is what this means for other states that genuinely do need this funding to replace piping infrastructure, especially through the Northeast corridor, the Midwest, through the Rust Belt, where there are older legacy cities with older infrastructure. So what does it mean for those communities insofar as this diversion of money to Florida?
Yeah, I think the stakes are pretty high here, and it's one reason that I thought this story was important, because it's not necessarily a standard case of the government wasting a little bit of taxpayer money. This is a case where we're talking about a huge public health measure the results are so tangible. Lead in the water causes developmental damage, brain damage to children. It's the reason that you're not supposed to eat lead paint chips when you're a kid. It lowers IQs. It leads to hyperactivity sometimes. It produces learning disabilities. So in these states like Illinois that genuinely do have very big concentrations of lead pipes, it's urgent that they get them out and replace them with copper. And there's not enough money in this program to cover every state's needs. The federal government has set aside $15 billion, but it probably costs something like 4 times that much to take care of everything that's needed. And so if money is wasted in Florida or even just held up, that means it's not going to cities like Chicago, where these kids are potentially imbibing lead in their water supplies every day. And
have you heard from any of the water districts in those communities directly about how this will impact them?
I spoke a little bit off the record with somebody in Massachusetts, but for whatever reason, their health department, Massachusetts is one of the states where this is an urgent problem, and they decided not to comment for the story. But they have said elsewhere that they know this is a huge public health crisis for them, and I know they're not happy.
Now, is there any recourse? Is there a point at which the EPA can step back and reevaluate and reappropriate, or is this pretty much a done deal at this point?
Yeah, so it's like set aside every year. It's like, I don't know, $250 million set aside for Florida. The utilities have to actually show that they need it. They have to say, look, this is what we're going to use it for, X, Y, and Z, and they don't get it until they can prove that. And so if in the long run they say, look, turns out the data is wrong, we actually don't have that many lead pipes, we actually don't need $1 billion, then the EPA has a mechanism to make sure that it gets reallocated somewhere where it's needed.
Nick Tabor is a freelance investigative reporter. The city of Orlando is a municipality that has no need for lead pipe replacement. They simply aren't used, and research into the early development of the city found they've never really been in use. Additionally, the Orlando Utilities Commission provides high-quality drinking water to the communities it serves. Bradley Jewell is the director of water production for the OUC. He joined us to answer some questions about the region's water, including where it comes from.
We're taking water from the lower Florida. All of our wells, we have 31 wells currently. They're drawing from about between 1,400 to 1,500 foot deep. So our water is very pure. The only thing OUC really needs to do is we use ozone to remove the hydrogen sulfide. That's the rotten egg odor you might smell if you're on a well system. And once we remove the hydrogen sulfide from the water, we just have a real simple treatment process. We add fluoride. The Dental Association requested that. And we also add chlorine in case there's a water main break or if there's something that possibly could get in the water. But our water is bacteriologically free.
And one of the narratives in Central Florida is the incredible population growth. Is that presenting any kind of challenges?
Yes, that is. And in the past, I'm talking back in the 80s and 90s, we assumed that we were always going to have more than enough water and we could just continuously pump out of the aquifer. But what the water management districts have shown us is that this does impact the natural springs in the area, some of the swamps and springs like the Wekiva Springs. So they're restricting how much water we can remove from the aquifer. So the more growth that demands water, we're trying to find alternative water supply.
Where are we looking?
Right now, we've just started a project called our Southeast Reverse Osmosis Water Treatment Plant, and we'll be taking water from a much greater depth, removing the minerals through reverse osmosis, and using that water to supplement the other water that we have.
Now, one of the reasons we're talking is I am following up on the federal funding for lead pipe replacement throughout the country. I spoke earlier with Nick Tabor about Florida's handle on the national funding mechanism. My question for you is there lead piping in Orlando? Is there going to be a need for replacement, or is this a non-issue for us?
This is a non-issue for us. We've started the survey work to go out and identify where the water meters are, see what our customers' water service is, and see what OUC's water service is. We have not uncovered any lead service lines yet. We've also been talking to our distribution crews, the guys and gals who are out in the field replacing those water lines. They've never encountered a lead service line. We've even gone as far back to talk to some of the retirees that are still with us, and they don't recall encountering a lead service line. So it'll be a non-issue with OUC.
Bradley Jewell is the Director of Water Production for the Orlando Utilities Commission. Coming up, we'll talk with an author that had his book about banned books banned. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Richard Copeland, sitting in for Sharon Stone. The state of Florida does not ban books, according to Governor Ron DeSantis. Back in February, he argued the state simply provides parents with the right to object to obscene material in school libraries. The statement was in response to a national spotlight that was being shown on Florida following the removal of more than 300 books from school shelves during the 2022-23 academic year. In recent years, conservative Americans have flooded school board elections in an effort to establish roots in local politics. The primary focus of their attention is on books they deem unacceptable for young students. These include books with LGBTQ+ themes, discussions about puberty and human development, books with messages of acceptance and tolerance, and even books with anti-establishment undertones. And this is how, in May of this year, Alan Gratz's book about banning books got banned. Gratz typically writes young adult historical fiction. Imagined accounts of 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and the Holocaust appear in his works. In 2016, he wrote a different kind of book. Titled Ban This Book, Gratz tells the story from the perspective of a middle school girl and her efforts to get her favorite book unbanned and returned to the shelves of her school library. The book, From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler by E.L. Konigsberg, tells the story of a brother and sister who run away from home and move into the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It is a book that has been banned for encouraging anti-authoritarian sentiments, though not in Florida. Ban This Book does mention other books that have been banned, and that is why the Indian River chapter of Moms for Liberty asked that it be removed from the district's middle school library. Last month, Gratz signed his name to a letter with other authors that have had their books banned by the Indian River School Board. Quote, the decision indicates that the removal was motivated by politics and not what is best for the students and families of Indian River County, unquote, Gratz said in his letter, asking for the book to be reinstated. I spoke with Alan Gratz about his book and its removal from Indian River Middle School. The irony that his book about banned books was banned was not lost on him. And I began our conversation by asking Gratz why he wrote Ban This Book.
At the time, book banning was kind of flying under the radar. The American Library Association was estimating that about 800 or 900 books were being challenged or banned in the United States every year. And these book bannings and challenges were happening in communities all over the country, not just particular regions, not just particular states. And but they were quietly happening. Books would be checked out and not returned by parents who wanted the books to disappear. And those challenges weren't being reported. And so those books were being removed without any kind of a stink made about them. And I wanted to write a book back then that highlighted what I felt like was something that was happening under the radar. Cut to today, not even 10 years later, and book banning has become an epidemic. And my little book about, hey, book bannings happen, we should be wary of this, is now front and center because book bannings are front and center. So when I wrote the book, I had very different intentions to call attention to something that I felt like wasn't getting a lot of press. Now, book bannings are all over the news, and I hope that Ban This Book still works as a primer for young readers to know how to fight back against censorship.
And I want to talk about the book itself. It is the story of Amy Ann, a middle schooler, who finds that her all-time favorite novel, The Mixed-Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler, which is a very real book. Many of us read that ourselves. I recall reading it. That the book has been removed from her school library, and it's about her efforts to get it reinstated. So first I want to ask, why did you choose that book?
So when I wrote the book, I had a choice to make. Was I going to make up fictional books, fictional fiction, that would be the books that are challenged in my book, or would I use real books? And I decided it would be much more powerful if I used real books. And so I, again, went to the American Library Association's incredible resources they have online and looked up books that had been challenged or banned in the United States since 1990. And all of the books then that are challenged or banned by the parent group in Ban This Book are books that had at some point in the United States been challenged or banned in that time, including from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankenweiler. And so I had very fond memories of that book from when I was a kid. And it was a book that had been challenged and banned because of disrespect to adults, because at one point, one of the characters cheats at cards on the bus, and in another scene, one of the characters takes money from the museum fountain to use to eat, to buy their food, and this was seen as stealing. And all of the reasons that the book had been challenged and banned felt very silly, much like I think many of the reasons that books are challenged or banned. And so it was a great way for me to highlight the silliness of it, but also use a book that many of us read when we were younger, and that is a touchstone for many of us in our youth. And so it was a good combination of things there, where the book was familiar and had a lot of things to talk about why somebody would ban a book like this. But it was a favorite, and that's why I focused on it.
You mentioned that the book was published in 2016. So before May of this year, did you get any kind of pushback or negative feedback regarding Ban This Book?
Not really. It's really been this year that Ban This Book has received the attention that it has. Look, you call a book Ban This Book, and the gauntlet is thrown, as they say. I challenged people to ban it, and somebody finally took me up on it. But I think up until that point, if people had been thinking about ban this book, that perhaps the irony had been a little too much for them, that maybe they couldn't imagine banning a book that literally is about book banning because it's a little on the nose. But this year somebody finally took me up on it.
So in May, the Indian River School Board bans the book at the insistence of the regional chapter of Moms for Liberty. What was your response to having to face this level of, not only this level of irony, but also to see a book banned that really doesn't contain any sexual content,
right,
no violence, no profanity?
Yeah.
What did that feel like? What was your reaction when you first heard about this?
Honestly, weariness. It felt like it was coming. I have had other books challenged for some of the reasons that you've said. I don't put any sex or language into my books. I write for middle schoolers and for younger readers even than that. So I don't include those by default. I write books about war. I write books about terrorism. I've written books about the Holocaust. There are some very difficult things in those that need to be shown for the reality of the situation. And so I have had books challenged and banned because of the darker reality that I present in those books. But you're right, Ban This Book doesn't have any of that. It is about a fourth grade girl who goes to a public school where a parent starts challenging and banning books. And that's the extent of the trouble. And so I had to just shake my head. I knew that at some point it was coming, though, because what we've seen is that when I wrote this book less than 10 years ago, the kind of books that were being challenged and banned are very different than the books that are being challenged and banned today. So back then, you had books like the Harry Potter books being challenged because of witchcraft. You had books like the Junie B. Jones series being challenged because she is anti-authoritarian, let's call it. In Captain Underpants, you had people wanting to challenge and ban it because of disrespect to adults. These things that people were banning books for seem gentle by comparison, because today the big focus is on banning books that have LGBTQ plus characters or BIPOC characters or authors who identify as those groups. And those are the main focus. And look, I am not gay, and I'm white. I don't fit into either of those categories. My main character in Ban This Book is a young black girl. That may be a reason that it first got opened and read, but that's the kind of books that are now being targeted. And if you look at the top 10 books that were challenged 10 years ago versus the top 10 books that are being challenged now, you can see that books are being challenged now as a part of the culture wars that are happening in the United States. And my book doesn't have any of those things really at its heart. I mean, it's hard to say that it's really a book. It's certainly not a book about the Black experience. My main character is Black. She's a reader. She's fighting book bans, but it's not about her race. But we're seeing books that have just those characters on the cover or those kind of authors being challenged and banned. And my book apparently dared to just mention some of the books that they have already banned in Indian River County. And that's why they banned my book, because they didn't want my book to even mention the books that they had already taken off the shelf, which I've said this before. I think that's erasure of the highest order. It's not enough that they took the books off the shelf the first time. Now they don't want us to even mention them.
Now, you and some other authors who have had books banned similarly at the Indian River School District wrote a letter that last week was read to the school board by some advocates for literary freedom. Can you tell me the gist of that letter and what kind of response you got from it?
Yeah, I was asked by Education Champions, a local group that is fighting for the freedom to read and fighting to protect public education in Indian River County. They were the first people to tell me about the ban, and they asked me if I would write a letter that they could read out loud at the school board, and they did that. I did write a letter, and they read it recently out loud. My letter basically said a lot of things I've just told you, that what's behind these book bannings is political and not what's best for the children and families of their county. I reminded them that their own book review committee in the county had read Ban This Book after it was challenged, decided that it was innocuous, and recommended it be put back on the shelf, and that the school board then overturned their decision and decided to ban this book. That is what we're seeing happen all over the country, is that trained professionals, librarians and educators who've gone to school for this, who know their students and know what's appropriate and inappropriate for their age level of reader, are being told that their expertise and their knowledge is not important, and that the school board, made up of elected officials, many of whom were swept in the elections of the last 4 to 6 years, with the support of groups like Moms for Liberty. A lot of these are candidates put up by groups like them. They're making the decision for everybody. And of course, groups like Moms for Liberty have these Orwellian names where what they're doing is actually restricting liberty. By banning these books, they're making the decision for every parent that no child can check out these books, rather than letting parents have the liberty to choose that on their own. So I reminded them of all these things in that letter, and asked them to reconsider putting Ban This Book back on the shelf. As I understand it, they doubled down and said that they would not do that. I didn't really expect them to do that, but I had to say something, and other authors have as well. What we really need, and what's going to happen, is the silent majority, the people who actually care about the freedom to read but have not turned out for school board elections, need to make those a priority. A lot of times these school board elections are being won with like 600 votes. They are definitely down ballot elections that are often not even held at the same time as presidential or congressional elections. And people have learned that if they just mobilize a small group of people, they can get their candidates on school boards, and they can start making really draconian changes against the will of most of their constituents.
And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, and I don't mean to sound too cynical, but has this ban helped book sales?
Sure. No, it's a really interesting question, and I love answering this because there's a myth that when your book is banned, that it leads to great sales. Almost 10 years ago, it was about 800 or 900 books that were getting challenged or banned. Now we are looking at 10 times that number. We are looking at almost 10,000 books a year that are being challenged or banned. Different titles. So you could have the same title challenged multiple times across the country. That's just individual titles. Most of those books disappear. Most of those books disappear from the shelf. They disappear from anybody's consciousness. They do not get copies of them bought and handed out to kids. We just can't do it with every book. And my book, because it's called Ban This Book, has gotten a lot of attention. But Indian River County did not just ban this book. There are hundreds of other books that they have banned, and those are not getting similar attention. So I've had modest growth in sales, but it's not put me on the bestseller list. And the bigger lesson here is that for most authors, their books just disappear. And for authors who are BIPOC or LGBTQ+, not only are their books disappearing from shelves, a big part of the income for kids' book writers is visiting schools, doing paid school visits, where a school will pay you an honorarium, they'll bring you in, you spend the day speaking to the kids and getting them fired up about your books and about reading. And those authors aren't getting invitations anymore because their school systems are worried about the backlash from these groups like Moms for Liberty, who are not in the majority, but will make enough of a stink that they'll make lives hell for the people at that school. And so to avoid all that, they are preemptively not inviting those authors to their schools. And what we may find is that they are preemptively also not putting their books on the shelf. So books may not be challenged or banned, but may not be added to collections for fear of a banning or a challenge.
That was Alan Gratz, author of Ban This Book, which has been banned from Indian River Middle School. The request to remove the book was placed by Jen Pippin, chair of the Indian River chapter of Moms for Liberty. The organization promotes conservative political action, specifically in schools. The group has targeted curriculum that promotes LGBTQ+ tolerance. It has labeled programs acknowledging the role of women and people of color as critical race theory, and has fought vaccine and mask mandates during and since the COVID pandemic. and they recommend the removal of books they deem unacceptable for youth. I spoke with Jen Pippin about her decision to recommend Ban This Book for removal. I asked her why a book with no reference to sex, race, gender, or violence was recommended for removal.
Moms for Liberty of Indian River challenged Ban This Book by Alan Gratz because it was telling children as young as 4 years old, they were in our elementary and middle schools. The book was telling children to check out books as young as 4 years old, because it was in one of our VPKs, to check out pornographic and sexually explicit books that were on the ALA, which is the American Library Association's books to be removed. So once we received that list from the American Library Association, we found out that many of the books that had been removed in our school district for pornographic or sexually explicit content were specifically mentioned in Ban This Book by Alan Gratz.
So if they were removed from the library, how would the children check that book out, having read about it in Alan Gratz's book?
Oh, excellent question. So that was actually brought up in one of the committee meetings. So they would not be able to have access to those books that were removed from the school libraries, but it could prompt them to look it up either on their, their laptops, their school issued laptops or iPads or cell phones, or if they go to the public library with their mom or their dad or their grandpa. Just like we wouldn't suggest children to go check out Hustlers or Playboys, we would not want to urge them to go check out these books that had been permanently removed and deemed illegal for Florida schools, even though they weren't allowed into the, to be in the school library.
Let me ask you this. If an author wrote a book that referenced Alan Gratz's book, what would the take on that be?
So the Ban This Book by Alan Gratz specifically didn't have sexually explicit content or pornographic information in it. It just referenced other books. So, I would have to look at case law and Florida law on that. But because his book is not specifically against Florida state statutes, I don't think it would be an issue if another book referenced Ban This Book. But if it did say, read Ban This Book and pick one of the titles mentioned in it to, create a book report or something, absolutely, because it was referencing another, book that could have pornographic or sexually explicit content, I would think so.
Jen Pippin is the chair of the Indian River chapter of Moms for Liberty. And that's all for today's edition of Engaged. Join us Tuesday when Sharon Stone returns. I'm Richard Copeland filling in. We want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about and what you're glad you heard. You can email us at engage@cfpublic.org, or you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. In the menu, select Send Us a Talkback, record your question, and hit send. Thank you for joining us for Engage on Central Florida Public Media. All Things Considered is next following NPR News.